Let's start with our top story. The Taliban say the conditional release of 1,500 prisoners ordered by the Afghan government goes against the Doha deal. Earlier, the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani signed a decree to release Taliban prisoners on 4 conditions.
Taliban spokesperson Sohail Shaheen says under the accord, the intra-Afghan talks were to open after the release of 5,000 prisoners. The spokesman said the Taliban have never agreed to the conditional release of prisoners. The president's spokesperson Sadiq Siddiqui said earlier the Taliban's written promise not to return to violence is among the preconditions for the swap. He said once intra-Afghan talks begin, the government will release 500 prisoners every 2 weeks. But the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission says prisoners accused of war crimes should not be released. U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad said the Taliban have already agreed to release up to 1,000 Afghan government prisoners.
Well, the United Nations has adopted a resolution supporting the Doha peace deal between the U.S. and Taliban. U.S. Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad says the resolution demonstrates the international community's confidence in the peace process. More on that now in this report.
Despite its early teething problems, the international community is throwing its weight behind the deal which aims to bring peace to war-torn Afghanistan. The UNSC resolution won the unanimous support of the 15-member council. It welcomes the intention of all Afghan parties to pursue the successful negotiation of an inclusive political settlement. But the US has warned Taliban that intensive violence can derail the peace process.
We acknowledge the Taliban have taken steps to stop attacks in cities and against major bases. But more needs to be done, and we urge them to also reduce violence against Afghan forces in the countryside, to give intra-Afghan negotiations and peace the opportunities to succeed.
Welcoming the agreement, German envoy to the UN, Christoph Eusgen, emphasized on significance of intra-Afghan talks.
We call for a speedy start of the intra-Afghan negotiations, and we welcome the announcement of the negotiating team by the government of Afghanistan today and hope that outstanding issues on the prisoners exchange can be resolved without delay.
The intra-Afghan talks is the next step in the peace process to strike a power-sharing formula between the Taliban and the Kabul government.
Well, the commander of U.S. Central Command, Kenneth McKenzie, says Washington supported the Taliban in their fight to push ISIS out of eastern Afghanistan. McKenzie told the House Armed Services Committee the Taliban received limited U.S. support. The commander said he was confident of the Taliban's reduced relations with ISIS in the country, but less confident of their connection to al-Qaeda. General McKenzie said the U.S. has begun reducing its military footprint in Afghanistan. He said the U.S. will reach its target of 8,600 troops in Afghanistan by the middle of summer. He said there is no plan to further reduce forces after reaching the initial troop level. In the U.S., former Vice President Joe Biden has won the key battleground state of Michigan in the latest round of the Democratic primaries. Biden has also taken Missouri, Mississippi, and Idaho to end the hopes of his rival Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Results in the states of North Dakota and Washington are still being counted. Exit polls show younger voters and Muslims went for Sanders, with older voters and African Americans voting for Biden. Speaking in Philadelphia, Biden called for party unity.
And I want to thank Bernie Sanders and his supporters for their tireless energy and their passion. We share a common goal, and together we'll defeat Donald Trump.
Well, both campaigns have called off planned rallies in Cleveland, citing guidance from Ohio public health officials on the new coronavirus outbreak. Well, Europe's political infrastructure has fallen prey to the novel coronavirus, with British and French MPs as well as cabinet ministers testing positive for the virus. In France, 4 MPs and a culture minister have been infected, while a junior health minister has tested positive in the UK. More on that now in this report.
India is rising as the novel coronavirus continues to spread across the world. In Europe, the whole of Italy, a country of some 60 million people, has been placed under quarantine. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has cancelled all public gatherings and asked people to stay at home.
Saranno quindi
That means that people shall avoid, on the whole territory, to move unless motivated by three specific circumstances: important work reasons, urgent necessary reasons, or health reasons.
ragioni di lavoro.
In the Middle East, Iran has reported 54 new deaths, raising the toll to over 290. The UN has recommended Tehran temporarily release all political prisoners, saying dual and foreign nationals are at risk in Iranian jails. This comes after Iran temporarily released 70,000 prisoners on Monday. Meanwhile, the WHO warns that the outbreak is threatening to become a global pandemic and can cost the world economy up to $2 trillion.
Now that the virus has a foothold in so many countries, the threat of a pandemic has become very real. But it would be the first pandemic in history that could be controlled. The bottom line is we're not at the mercy of the virus.
In the US, incoming White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows has self-quarantined, saying he might have come into contact with an infected person. In Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo has also confirmed its first coronavirus case. Meanwhile, Mongolia has barred anyone from entering or leaving its cities for 6 days after reporting its first case of the disease.
U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper has postponed his visit to Pakistan, India, and Uzbekistan due to the rapid spread of the new coronavirus. Esper was scheduled to visit the region from March 16th to 20th for talks aimed at promoting the Afghan peace process. The Defense Secretary was scheduled to arrive in Islamabad on March 19th for an overnight stay. In a statement, Pentagon spokesperson Alyssa Farah said, out of an abundance of caution, the Secretary has decided to postpone his travel. She said Esper will remain in the U.S. to help manage the Department of Defense's response to the outbreak of COVID-19. Pakistan's role in peace negotiations between the U.S. and Taliban was lauded by the international community. 12 inmates have died in prison riots at 23 jails across Italy in the past 3 days in unrest sparked by panic over the coronavirus. Inmates started fires and took workers as hostages before soldiers surrounded the buildings to prevent escapes. The Justice Ministry, which says the situation is now under control, blamed the deaths on drug overdoses that happened when prisoners broke into medical stores. The ministry said the unrest at prisons in Venice, Palermo, and Pagliarelli, among others, has ended. The country's prisoner rights ombudsman has blamed the riots on prison overcrowding and fears of the rapid spread of coronavirus. The unrest began on Sunday over rule changes, including the suspension of family visits in jails to prevent coronavirus spreading. Well, we've seen the problems, the lockdowns, and the fear caused by coronavirus. But what is it actually like to be infected with the virus? Patients and survivors have spoken of their experiences.
The COVID-19 virus is part of the coronavirus family, like the ordinary seasonal flu. Symptoms include cough, fever, and shortness of breath. Severe cases can result in more dangerous symptoms, like pneumonia, stroke, and kidney failure. But these are only likely to be seen in senior citizens.
But I'm a young person and I'm healthy, so the symptoms I'm having are like a normal cold, like a flu. I had a little bit of fever, headache, general discomfort, but anyone would have thought it was just a cold.
As of 3rd March, the World Health Organization estimates the virus has a mortality rate of just 3.4%. This is far lower than the 2003 SARS virus, also a member of the coronavirus group, which had a mortality rate of 10%. Many patients say the most grueling part of being infected is the isolation.
I will stay in my house for about 14 days, and in these 14 days, the health authorities will monitor my situation. I live in a separate room in my home, and I use a separate bathroom. My wife and my son live in the other part of the house, but they are subject to the so-called quarantine too. Luckily, they are fine. They don't have any kind of symptoms.
The novel coronavirus has now been detected on 5 continents. The situation is already under control in the outbreak's epicenter, China's Wuhan city. So far, 100,000 people have been infected by the virus worldwide, out of which 4,000 have died.
Well, in the U.S., the city of San Francisco is renting 30 recreational vehicles to homeless people. Costing just above $440,000, the vehicles will be available for people who have tested positive for the novel coronavirus. Find out why the city is doing this in this report.
San Francisco is trying to solve two problems at once: what to do for people who don't have a home, and what to do for people who tested positive for coronavirus. The answer, says the city, is to rent out 30 recreational vehicles to COVID-19 patients without a place to call home but need to be isolated. The RVs have been paid for by funds made available from an emergency declaration by Mayor London Breed.
Well, so as people are test positive, whether they are, they're identified through the public health system or through their healthcare provider, and it's determined that they do not have a safe place to self-isolate, then the Department of Public Health will work with the Emergency Operations Center to place people into these RVs.
Officials say the object of the exercise is to protect the city's most vulnerable people, including the 8,000 or so who live in shelters, on the streets, or with family and friends.
Well, I think that the mayor and the city has made it very clear that our number one priority is vulnerable populations, right? People that have older adults, people that have underlying medical conditions, people experiencing homelessness are often more susceptible.
At the moment, the city has confirmed 14 coronavirus cases. Nationwide, 3/4 of U.S. states have COVID-19, with nearly 1,000 cases and 29 deaths.
Let's now get to some other news. Israeli forces have wounded 13 Palestinian protesters staging a sit-in on top of Mount Al-Arma in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian health officials say the Israeli military fired live and rubber bullets at protesters in the city of Nablus. Israeli forces also fired tear gas towards demonstrators. Medics say some protesters were suffocated or half suffocated from gas inhalation. Witnesses say Israeli soldiers even prevented ambulances from approaching the mount, which worsened the condition of those wounded. Israeli forces have killed over 350 Palestinians and have wounded about 18,000 since March 2018. An Israeli court has rejected Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plea to postpone the opening session of his corruption trial. A panel of judges of the Jerusalem District Court decided the trial will begin on March 17th. The court said Netanyahu will be required to attend the opening session when the charges against him will be read out. The Israeli Prime Minister has been indicted on counts of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in 3 separate criminal cases. Earlier this week, Netanyahu's lawyers asked the court to delay opening the trial for 45 days. Lawyers said they needed scanned copies of the evidence against the prime minister. Netanyahu is the first incumbent prime minister to stand trial in the history of Israel. Elsewhere, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has urged the Libyan strongman Khalifa Haftar to respect the UN-brokered ceasefire for Libya. Meeting Haftar in Berlin, Merkel said steps should begin to open the political process and end the conflict. In a statement, Merkel's spokesman Stefan Seibert said the Chancellor discussed Libyan developments with Haftar. Seibert said Merkel stressed that there can be no military solution to the conflict. The statement said it is necessary to progress for a political process in line with conclusions of the Berlin conference. 2 months ago, Merkel hosted an international Libya conference in Berlin to support a ceasefire and respect the arms embargo. Libya has been torn by a raging civil war between the Government of National Accord and Libyan National Army since April last year. I'll be back after a break with plenty more news. Stay tuned for that. Let's begin this segment of the bulletin in Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition has carried out 16 airstrikes on districts of Hajjah province. State media said the strikes hit Harad, Bakail al-Mer and Medi, among others. No casualties have yet been reported. The strikes come after the coalition said it foiled an attack on an oil tanker off the Yemeni coast last week. Coalition spokesman Turki al-Malki said the ship was sailing towards the Gulf of Aden when it was attacked by 4 small boats. Yemen has been racked by anarchy since 2014, when Houthis overran much of the country, including the capital, Sana'a. The U.S. says it is in the process of bringing air defense systems into Iraq. The head of U.S. Central Command, Kenneth McKenzie, said the move is meant to counter a potential attack from Iran. The Pentagon's decision follows Iran's earlier attack on U.S. troops in Iraq. Earlier this year, Washington announced it wanted permission from Baghdad to bring Patriot missiles into the country. On January 8th, Iran struck the Al-Assad airbase, host to 2,000 U.S. troops, with a volley of missiles. The White House initially denied there were any casualties, but an unspecified number of soldiers from the base have since received treatment for brain injuries. Turkey says it has killed 4 militants of the Kurdistan Workers' Party in airstrikes during a counter-terrorist operation in northern Iraq. In a statement, Turkey's National Defense Ministry said military operations backed by air power were carried out in the Hakurk region. The ministry said Turkey will continue to destroy weapons caches and shelters used by the terrorists. It said over 400 Kurdish militants have been killed in northern Iraq over the past 5 months. Turkey holds the PKK responsible for the deaths of some 40,000 people in a 30-year conflict. The U.S. says it is discussing with NATO what assistance to give to Turkey in Syria's Idlib province. The U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, James Jeffrey, says Washington is considering what will be done if Russia and the Syrian government break the ceasefire. Jeffrey was speaking alongside the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, David Satterfield, in a conference call. He said the United States is looking at NATO capabilities in this scenario. Jeffrey said Ankara needed to clarify its stance on the purchase of the Russian S-400 air defense system. Meanwhile, military delegations from Turkey and Russia have met in Ankara under the agreement reached last week. On March 5th, the Turkish and Russian presidents agreed on a ceasefire and joint military patrols in Idlib. In Syria itself, 3 people have been killed by a landmine left behind by rebels in northern Hama province. State media said the mine exploded in agricultural land surrounding the city of Murek. It said rebels have left mines in much of the northern countryside. Officials say they have been trying to map minefields to prevent further casualties. Since the beginning of the Syrian war, over 100 civilians across the country have been killed by exploding landmines. Myanmar's parliament has blocked a bid by Aung San Suu Kyi's party to reduce the military's role in the country's politics. Military MPs who occupy 25% of seats in parliament vetoed the changes. The amendments were calling for a gradual reduction of the number of military MPs in parliament. The blocked proposals would have removed a section naming the Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Services as the supreme commander of the entire military. Lawmakers rejected removal of the word disciplined from the definition of the country's political system as a genuine, disciplined, and multi-party democratic system. Any changes to the charter require the approval of more than 3/4 of lawmakers, which automatically gives the army an effective veto power. A Pakistan Air Force F-16 fighter jet has crashed during rehearsals for the Pakistan Day celebrations in the country's capital, Islamabad. In a statement, the PAF said the accident occurred near Shakarparian area of the capital. The Air Force said Wing Commander Noman Akram embraced martyrdom in the crash. The force said a board of inquiry has been ordered by Air Headquarters to determine the cause of the accident. Russia says it may hold talks with OPEC on the output cuts planned by Saudi Arabia. Energy Minister Alexander Novak says Moscow remains open to cooperation on stabilizing the oil market. Oil prices jumped 8% a day after they hit a 30-year low, with Saudi Arabia preparing to boost production. Russia had earlier refused to cut supplies, as proposed by OPEC. European markets are trading marginally higher as investors continue to speculate over the impact of coronavirus and the oil price war. Emergency interest rates cuts by Bank of England to inject stimulus has somewhat picked up market sentiments. The CAC 40 in Paris is trading over 2.5% higher, while Frankfurt's DAX has gained over 2%. London's FTSE 100 is trading 1.5% higher ahead of the UK's annual budget announcement. In Asia, Seoul's Kospi led the losses, closing over 2.5% lower. The Nikkei 225 lost over 2% after investors parked their stakes in safe haven equities. The Shanghai Composite traded nearly 1% lower. Meanwhile, international Brent crude oil price has lost over 0.5%, shedding early gains amid the ensuing price war between OPEC and Russia. Time to find out what the weather is like around the world. There you have it. You're all caught up. Thank you for watching this bulletin here at Indus News. For the latest updates, you can always follow us on our social media at Indus.News.